All right, good morning. Good morning. Robert Warren here, author of the Bitcoin Miners Almanac, here to talk a little bit more about Bitcoin mining, of course. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about a question that comes up every cycle, every few years, and it's the question of the Bitcoin miner security budget. Maybe you've heard the phrase, maybe you haven't. It is always popping up every couple of years when things get rough or when things get good or when just general FUD is flying around. I'm here to contend today that there's no such thing as a Bitcoin miner security budget. It's a made up statistic, fake news, not real, and there's a very, very logical explanation for why. But first, let's explore it a little bit. Okay, Justin Bonds. I don't know anything about this guy, but this tweet was doing some numbers. He said he's been warning people about BTC's flawed security model for many years now. It's utterly unsustainable. Every halvening has security. This should be feared, not celebrated. Price drops also reduce security. Just look at the last year. The security budget has collapsed. Of course, what he's measuring here is revenue for miners revenue. What else do we have? More recently, Bitcoin still has the problem that it has to pay miners 40 plus million per day for the same security that Ethereum gets at a fraction of the cost. Okay, so we're using this security term, equating it with something akin to money that's being made and stating that Ethereum is better. Okay, next one. Whether it's the security budget issue or mining centralization risk, we're not going to admit we're wrong until something big happens. Okay, so there's something out there, something could fail here. And of course, these are tweets out of context. This is just searching about Bitcoin security budget and seeing what people are saying within the last, 24 hours today. Bitcoin is a pretty expensive 51% attack, but definitely not a $10 trillion expense. I don't see an entity putting that much value on chain if the security budget of the blockchain doesn't support it. So this is the idea that, if you cannot pay the people who are mining, and we equate mining with security, which is actually not true in and of itself. Your Bitcoins are secured by cryptography. The settlement and issuance of the Bitcoin, the function of the Bitcoin network, comes through Bitcoin mining, but not the security. So that's a bit of a misnomer in and of itself. And most recently, this is actually what prompted me to put my thoughts together on this matter, is an essay from a PhD by the name of Michael Warren. He's a professor, no relation in the Warrens, but he wrote a great essay called On Bitcoin as a Reserve Asset. And the reason I really like him is because if you're going to have critics of something that you like, you want your critics to be smart. You want to really like your critics. And I really like Micah. He's a brilliant guy and he puts together brilliant stuff. And this is what he says. I'll read it to you because this is what prompted this entire response here, this entire presentation. So he says this. To bring in numbers, today Bitcoin's market cap is about $2 trillion. The security budget, that is the amount paid to miners, is around $16 billion per year. Of this $16 billion revenue, we can assume that only a small chunk of it is profits. If Bitcoin is worth $1 million in 2045, then the market cap is about $21 trillion, and the security budget is around $5 billion per year. So a $21 trillion asset is secured by $5 billion worth of revenue. Safe to say this is, for this competitive by design industry, well under $1 billion, if not under $100 million in profit. Now we're in a goofy place. A rogue hedge fund could, for a relatively small amount of money, commandeer and brick the entire $20 trillion ecosystem for fun and profit. A global adversary could slowly stockpile these machines or even produce their own mining Bitcoin while profitable. Then guess what? They now have the power to freeze our stash or simply make a joke of the Bitcoin protocol. Why would they do this? Probably because it would be ROFL hilarious to watch the USA realize they just lost trillions betting on internet currency. So this is, of course, a critique of the idea of using Bitcoin as a reserve asset, something that has recently come to the fore with the elections, with the legislation that Senator Lummis is pushing. And this is a very, very smart guy making a critique based strictly on the numbers. And what I'm contending is that it's entirely nonsensical, entirely ridiculous, and entirely false on very, very obvious first principles reasons. So let's jump into it. There is no such thing as a security budget. Asterisk. What are people referring to? Let's start with brass tacks and start from the machine. What people are referring to when they're talking about the security budget. And if we take Mike as example as the best stated critique of this quote unquote problem that I'm contending doesn't exist. And we look at a familiar chart, which is that a machine, a Bitcoin mining machine, has essentially, three physical connections to the world. It has its cooling system, which is moderated by mechanical engineering, by the physics of the thing. But we're not going to talk about that because that's what changes your joules per terahash, your uptime, the way that you run the machine. You have your electricity expense, which is something you buy, generally speaking. So we're not going to talk about that right off the bat. And then you have this thing, your revenues, called hash price, which is this commoditized value that you are able to get from the network for providing work that has value. This thing called hash price. Okay, so let's jump into the revenues, because that's what we're talking about. We're saying there are not enough revenues coming into Bitcoin mining to justify the operation of this whole thing. The whole thing falls apart. This is what people are contending, because the revenues are not sustainable. All right, we can break that down. How are miners paid? Asterisk again. Okay, let's keep an eye on that asterisk. This is an image from Luxor's hash rate index. They are the folks who first formally coined this idea of hash price, which is essentially the commoditized value of your petahash or terahash, the work that your machine is doing. And you can see, since 2019, you get this spike coming into 2020 where the bull run takes off and your hash price is increasing. So what we're seeing is that revenues going into miners are spiking up. They're making tons of money relative to the terahash or the petahash that they are offering the work they are doing for the network. And then you see in 2021, coincident with the bear market that we went through, the price is going down and down and down and down, and miners are making less per unit of work that they do. That's not a good way to run a business. If I put in more effort and get less out, it's not a great business. We're supposed to go the opposite way in business. We're supposed to become more efficient and more productive with fewer inputs. And then you see something interesting in April of 2024, late April, which is that you have this sharp spike down, and that, of course, is the halving event, where what miners were making almost overnight was cut approximately 50% in half. The Coinbase reward, the subsidy that miners get in each block, sliced in half. And we know this is going to happen every 4 years. And then what you see coming into today is that you have some rise with the rise of the price of Bitcoin and a couple other factors which we'll go into. But this is hash price. Okay, so how is hash price determined? Hash price is a function of four inputs. First one is network difficulty. So this is known. Network difficulty is known because your Bitcoin miner is hashing to achieve a target difficulty. So it's known all across the network. The next one is Bitcoin's price. Okay, that's also known. At any given moment, you can know what the price of Bitcoin is. You just look and see what it's trading at. The next one is the block subsidy. Well, that's also known. Every 4 years, it cuts in half. But for that intermittent 4-year period, you know what the subsidy is going to be. You know what you're going to be rewarded with every single block until that next halving. And the next component of hash price is, of course, transaction fees. It's not free to get on the bus when you're trying to transact on Bitcoin. You have to pay a fee. Transaction fees, we don't necessarily know what they are over time or what they will be, but we know what they are at any given moment because if I'm looking into my mempool instance or I'm looking at somebody else's node and seeing what they're predicting the mempool is, we can get a sense of how much it costs to get on the bus, to get into a block. That's transaction fees. Bitcoin's hash price will change with every new block added to the blockchain. So this is directly from, formatted a little bit differently, but directly from the language that Luxor has on their website. And this is how hash price, your revenues, are determined, how you are paid by the network. So let's run through them. Let's make some base assumptions. Network difficulty. This is a network difficulty chart since 2022. And as you can see, it is consistently going up. It is becoming harder. So that seems to indicate to us that the more work you do, the less you're going to get. Okay, well, that's not really a +1 for this whole security budget thing. It doesn't look great if there's more stuff coming up, more miners getting on the network, and it's just getting more difficult over time. All right, let's look at the next one. We have price since late 2021 or 2020, early 2021. All right, well, there's some volatility there. There's those stretches where we get this bear market going from 2022 all the way to 23 and early 24. All right, well, price is maybe a counteracting force, a countervailing force, where over time we assume price is going to go up, but we don't control price. This network difficulty is just steadily marching on, and price is kind of varying wildly up and down, but generally over time it seems that maybe if we can survive, the price will go up, but we don't know to where, we don't know how much. All right, block subsidy. If you look here, you see this purple line that is straight until it takes a totally vertical drop. That's our block subsidy. Now we know, and it's actually kind of funny if you look at this chart on the far right hand side, it seems to be not updated until April because it's actually missing, it looks like, a halving. But we know our subsidy is going to be sliced in half approximately every 4 years. So we know where that one is going, basically. We know that it is trending continuously down to 2140 when the last Bitcoin will be mined. So that doesn't look good. That's kind of a knock against this whole miner subsidy thing, this whole security budget thing where, oh man, you're going to get less, the difficulty is going to be higher, and you're going to have a lot of wiggliness in the price, but you can't necessarily predict it. All right, let's look at transaction fees. And these are transaction fees over a very long time. So since 2011, so very early days of the network. What you see here is an average transaction fee over that time, 13 sats per vbyte. And you see these intermittent spikes where you have huge use of the network. And maybe if you're generous, you would say that we're getting more use over time, or the average might be going up over time, but it doesn't look like anything that would be adding huge amounts of revenue to this miner security budget problem. So for the time being, while we know that the general trend ought to, quote unquote, based on the incentives, be that block subsidy reduces, but then is slowly replaced by transaction fees, we don't really see, in a consistent sense, that there is this massive demand for block space. So that's another hard one to say that we can have any kind of predictive power about. So that might be 3 against Bitcoin, 1 for, where network difficulty is getting harder, price, I guess it's going up, block subsidy is definitely going down, and transaction fees are just kind of a crapshoot at this point. So aside from price pumps and intermittent fee spikes, the forecast doesn't really look good. It doesn't look good. It looks like the security budget scarebros are winning. They're totally right. But they're missing something. Let's go to my initial asterisk. How are miners paid? So when people are normally generating what I think is FUD around this whole security budget question, they're trying to answer the question of how are miners paid. But they're actually asking a different question and answering a different question. They're asking the question, how are miners paid by the network? Which is very different from the broader question of how are miners paid? So it appears that miners will make less over time, yes, from the network. And if you only thought that miners were being paid from the network, you might contend that there was a massive security issue in this declining security budget for Bitcoin miners. But, this is a big one, Bitcoin miners don't only hash to make money from the network. They don't. And this is something that I think is not common knowledge. It's obvious, but it's not intuitive. You have to not just look at the network, but you have to look at the miners. You have to understand these things from a really base level first principles. And it comes down fundamentally to this idea of Nakamoto consensus versus business. Are Bitcoin miners simply participants in this Nakamoto consensus, this proof of work incentivized schema where they make money in Bitcoin, or are they businesses, or maybe some hybrid of both? To restate this question, we're talking about the difference between internally versus externally regulated systems. Internally versus externally regulated systems. When we say internally regulated system, we're talking about the Nakamoto consensus. We're talking about this highly calculable payment scheme of how much money you're going to make being paid from the network. But Bitcoin mining is not fundamentally restricted to being internally regulated. We are externally regulated. We are regulated by the world within which we operate. And that's because we use a proof of work scheme that necessitates that we operate as businesses, that we don't just operate in the domain of an idea. We operate in the real world using real resources. The simplest way to look at it would be to say, okay, this is a Bitcoin mine, and all this does is make money. But that would be a naive take of what this thing does. You cannot frame every Bitcoin miner as having the exact same business model where all they do is consume energy, electricity, through their machines of some efficiency that they have, depending on their models, and through their uptime that they're able to maintain through how well they're able to operate. They then generate some very calculable and known revenue based on hash price. That is an extremely naive way to look at a Bitcoin miner. It is one business model. It is 100% true that it is a business model, but it is not the business model for Bitcoin mining and will not be going forward. But you have this thing called ideological mining, which dashes aside the entire security budget problem. Now, the limitations to ideological mining, which we'll get into a second, definitely exist. But the existence of ideological mining, and what do I mean by that? I mean individuals that mine as a hobby, that mine for pleasure, that mine to decentralize the network, that mine just because they like the BitAxe product, which is what you see here. They are not concerned with the revenue that they are generating through their BitAxe. They're not trying to run a profit and loss. They're not trying to hit a point where they hit their payback and pay off their BitAxe. They're not. They're simply mining because ideologically they want to support the network. And that's an entirely legitimate reason to mine. Now, the limit of this is one of scale, where you're not going to run this thing if you want to scale it up to run and pull 200 amps. Why? Because your cost of electricity becomes prohibitive. But when it's small and when it's pushing out a couple of terahash, yeah, I will happily mine ideologically all day. And that's a totally legitimate way to mine. Now you can say, well, that will never compete with the really large operators. That's true, that won't. But it is a growing way to mine, and it will continue to be a legitimate way to mine. Ideological mining is something that exists, that people are happy to do, they like to do to support the network, and in no way, shape, or form is that included in this initial idea of a security budget. It's just not there, but people are still doing it. Now you might say, logically, it doesn't make sense. Well, it doesn't matter if it logically makes sense to you. People are doing it. They want to support the network, and that seems logical enough to me. And what's more, you should pay attention to what they do and not what you think about what they do. But here's another example. We don't just mine for hash price. You also mine for utility, for heat. Okay. You see on the bottom left the fog hashing unit, and you see on the right-hand side one of the Mara Holdings two-phase immersion cooling system. Now, what do both of these units do? They produce heat. So, I can mine for revenue with these things. That's the whole point, is that you have the Bitcoin miner, which is something that generates revenue, known revenue due to hash price. We're consuming electricity that ideally is very low cost to us. And then what we're doing is we're taking an output from our process, which is heat, and we're using it as an input to another process. Now, this is captured nowhere in the security budget FUD. The idea that your resources that you're taking in and what you're pushing out as waste might actually be useful to somebody else. Now, this is a very new aspect of the Bitcoin network, the idea of mining for heat, but it's growing and it will only continue to be more valuable as the network grows. You can produce low-grade heat that in many situations it becomes very, very important to have consistent, quality, controllable heat as an input to a process. And by bolting on this Bitcoin miner thing, you are negating in a lot of ways the risks of this security budget FUD, because you have tapped yourself into the real world and made yourself useful to another process. Okay, here's another example. This is another example of, yes, pure play mining, but also utility mining. And this is not utility in generating heat for some system to take as an input. It's rather utility that's being generated in the frequency management of a grid and the financial management of a electrical trading scheme, electrical trading domain. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at, of course, Riot's Corsicana site. And this will be eventually planned out as a 1.4, I believe, 1.2 full capacity, but 1 gigawatt operational, which is 1,000 megawatts of operational mining. Now, you take high efficiency machines, you put them into immersion, and you operate them as efficiently as you can. You have an input, which is your cost of electricity, which in ERCOT in Texas is free floating, but you can hedge it with large financial hedges in some ways, or you can just ride the spot price, which is known in ERCOT, and you try to run and operate profitably. Well, under that security budget FUD, you would say that all of these sites are going to be deprecated because it's going to become too competitive. You're not going to be able to mine and make any money because you're losing your resources. However, this ignores that these sites are very valuable to ERCOT as a way to manage frequency of the grid. And what do I mean by that? The grid operator, during times of high demand, when folks are pulling a lot of load from ERCOT, need to have a resource they can call on to turn off. And that hasn't really existed until large-scale Bitcoin miners. What you generally have to do is you have to add more supply to meet the existing demand, because most of your demand is commercial or residential or retail. Now, you have this new tool that can be used by the grid, which is a large load that you can ask to turn off. And it's existed in some large commercial settings, but generally speaking, if you're running a large steel foundry, a metals foundry, you really don't want to be curtailed and turned off. You want to be operating when you can operate because they have very tight production schedules and processes. But you can do that to a Bitcoin mine, and you can financially reward that Bitcoin mine, which in no way, shape, or form plays into Nakamoto consensus and the way that miners are rewarded from the network. This is how they're rewarded from the real world. Same thing in the finance world. In ERCOT, there is the whole world of trading energy, of buying options on energy. And with these very large Bitcoin mines, can actually come in and operate as large financial operators where they are trading and reducing, in some sense, volatility in the markets, because they can buy and sell and actually take delivery of extremely large loads of electricity. So they are making real what was once strictly a financial market by being able to play in both domains. None of this lives anywhere in this idea of a security budget, because we're not talking about the internally regulated system of Nakamoto consensus. We're talking about the world of business and proof of work in the real world. Here's another example. State-level mining. Large nation states have non-monetary reasons why they would want to use their resources to mine Bitcoin. There's twofold. Not just to generate Bitcoin or to be rewarded in Bitcoin, but also if they want to transact and if they are building their own templates to get their particular transactions on the network. So I won't go into this one in such great detail because it's still quite early, to be frank with you, in terms of what these large state actors are doing. And I think there's a lot there left to be researched. But that is another non-internally regulated reason why somebody would mine Bitcoin at the state level. And what we're looking at here is both on the left-hand side, a photo, and then on the right-hand side, again, a photo, but it looks like it's from a satellite above, the mining operations in Bhutan, which have been running, it looks like, on some form of underutilized or stranded hydro, and have apparently been very, very successful for the state of their state coffers, so to speak. But again, that's externally regulated. That's a geopolitical incentive. That is not something that is regulated internally. Now here's the core thesis. Here's where it all breaks down. Because proof of work requires we operate in the real world and use real resources, Bitcoin mining is determined not only by the incentives of Nakamoto consensus, but also by the rules of business. So to go back to our original asterisk, there is no such thing as a security budget unless you include all of the additional sources of value and utility that Bitcoin miners generate in their operations. And that's it. My name's Robert Warren. I'm the author of the book, The Bitcoin Miner's Almanac. I love talking about this stuff. Let me know if you have additional questions. I'm more than happy to connect. You can find me on X, Twitter, at Bikes and Bitcoin. And let me know what you think. I'm around. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. More coming.